Hello everyone, and welcome to the Laude Post ICANN update. I'm Alexander Chinikov, creative lead at Laude, and I'm joined by Susan Payne, who's head of legal policy, Ashley Roberts, head of new TLD consultancy, and Sophie Hay, who is our policy advisor. In this episode of the Laude podcast, we'll be covering the policy forum that took place in Kigali, and we'll provide you with a recap of the key topics discussed at ICANN80. Let's start by looking at RDRS.
Thanks, Alex. So, as a reminder, the Registration Data Request Service, or RDRS, is the system that ICANN has built to manage the submission of requests for registration data, for the disclosure of non-public registration data, that is, and to transmit those requests on to participating registrars. This is intended as a pilot effort for up to 2 years to gather data about the demand and to help the ICANN board determine whether to build a more permanent system with perhaps some additional elements such as a feature to accredit requesters, for example. The RDRS has been running now since November, with ICANN producing monthly status reports. And I think whilst it's too early really to be drawing firm conclusions, it does appear that the number of submitted requests has dropped off from the high point in January of 291 down to just 156 during May. It's not really possible to say whether this reflects that requesters are learning which requests are appropriate for the system, or whether it reflects frustration of using a system that's described on both sides as being clunky when the outcome is still not necessarily getting the data disclosed in response to a request. It may be a combination of the two. In any event, during ICANN80, both the commercial stakeholder group and the registrar stakeholder group held feedback sessions, with the registrar stakeholder group session being more of a workshop format where small groups considered real-life, anonymized examples and discussed what decisions on disclosure they would have expected. Based on the small group that I was in, as well as the feedback from the groups given in the wrap-up, in most cases there was actually quite good alignment on the disclosure decisions. But unfortunately, what the session didn't really allow for was time to dig in on those situations where there was less alignment between the expectations of the requesters and the decision being made by the registrar. And this would definitely be a fruitful exercise for the future. From my perspective, I think one of the key takeaways that I got for requesters was that terminology matters. A few registrars expressed their view that they don't consider that it's appropriate for them to disclose registration data in order to allow a requester to investigate or to make out their case. And such requests are therefore always refused by them. And whether you agree with that interpretation or not, as a requester, I think if you're not getting back the disclosure that you expect, you may want to look at the wording you use and avoid using general terms like investigation of IP infringement to see whether that has an impact on the responsiveness. So that's all for now on the RDRS, but it's as I say, an ongoing pilot for up to 2 years. So I'll hand over now to my colleague Ashley, who will be talking about next round of new gTLDs and particularly the fees.
Great, thank you, Susan. So as many of you will be aware, one of the biggest unknowns for the next round of new gTLDs has been how much ICANN is going to charge for an application. But discussion of the fee finally began last week at the ICANN80 meeting, and ICANN began by providing an indication of what the fee is likely to be. A key principle of the fee is that it should be based on cost recovery. So in other words, the amount that ICANN receives from application fees should be sufficient to cover the cost of running the new gTLD program. Therefore, they've estimated how much they think the program will cost based on a series of assumptions. In ICANN's cost model, they considered 4 scenarios. One scenario assumed that they receive 500 new gTLD applications. Another scenario assumed 1,000 applications. The third assumed 1,500 applications, and then they had one assuming 2,000 applications. And the estimated cost range across those 4 scenarios was between $208,000 and $293,000 per application. However, ICANN pointed out that there are still a couple of next round policies being developed that will have a cost associated with them to implement the policies. And so until those policies have actually been finalized by ICANN, we won't know what their cost will be. So those amounts will need to be factored into the overall cost of the program later on. And so what that means is that the final application fee is likely to be a little higher than the $208,000 to $293,000 range, which has been presented by ICANN so far. Because ICANN doesn't know exactly how many applications it will receive, and thus what the optimal fee will be to cover the costs of the program, they've suggested that what they may do is set a fee that's towards the higher end of their range, and then if the actual number of applications that they receive is higher than their assumption, they would then credit a certain amount back to applicants to account for the lower marginal cost of each application. So what does this all mean for prospective new gTLD applicants? Well, we think it's important news and an important development. Although it doesn't confirm exactly what the application fee will be, it does provide a pretty useful guide as to what the fee will be, and hopefully that's sufficient to allow organizations to begin their internal planning and budgeting process for the application. With that, I'm going to excuse me, I'm going to hand back to Susan to talk about some other developments with the rules for the next round.
Thanks, Ashley. Yes, and again, with respect to the next round, I'd say the majority of the policy recommendations that were developed by the subsequent procedures working group have been adopted already by the ICANN board last year, and work is well underway to implement these. But there are a few recommendations which remain outstanding, and these include on some of the trickier issues. So at ICANN80, we did see some further movement on some of these, including on registry voluntary commitments and on contention resolution. So looking at registry voluntary commitments, or RVCs first, this is the term that's used to refer to voluntary contractual restrictions that a registry operator might be willing to adopt and commit to in its registry agreement with ICANN. And that might be something that they do either proactively in order to demonstrate their intent to be a good actor, or in order to meet concerns or objections raised by another entity or a group, such as a company concerned that a TLD might infringe their brand, or a government with public interest concerns. So in the 2012 round, we did see such commitments being adopted into registry agreements for some TLDs. But since then, the ICANN bylaws have been updated as a result of work intended to maintain ICANN's accountability after the IANA transition removed the oversight of the US government. So the new bylaws for ICANN post-transition emphasize ICANN's role as a technical organization and expressly state that ICANN shall not regulate services that use the Internet's unique identifiers or the content that such services carry or provide outside of the express scope of its mission. Having grappled with this issue for some time, and after conducting a community consultation on the parameters of this content prohibition, the ICANN board has now resolved that it will not permit any RVCs or other comparable registry commitments that restrict content in gTLDs. What this means is that although RVCs will still be permitted, those that are likely to be allowed will need to be focused on matters such as the eligibility of who can be a registrant, rather than on what such registrants might do with the domain and any associated website that they run on it. So a registry operator could still impose that latter type of content restriction directly on registrants via its own registry policies, for example. And it could indeed do so as part of a settlement with a third-party objector of the type that I was talking about. But this is not something that they could commit to in their registry agreement, and so it's not something that ICANN would hold them to. Nevertheless, I think disappointing as I think some of us feel that interpretation is, we do at least have a degree more certainty of what will and won't be permitted in the next round, and it really allows the next round to move forward, and applicants to have some understanding of the types of arrangements they might be able to enter into if they need to do so to overcome some problems. The other issue that I mentioned that where there was some movement is contention resolution. During the 2012 round, if there was more than one applicant for the same TLD, they were encouraged to resolve the ownership of that TLD privately. As a result of this, that frequently meant that money changed hands either directly or via a private auction process. Where the parties couldn't resolve privately, then ICANN operated what was called an auction of last resort. And in that case, the final amount paid by the winner went to ICANN and went into a fund called the auction proceeds. So there's been significant criticism of these processes, including from governments, and ICANN's Governmental Advisory Committee has issued advice on this more than once. One aspect of that advice was that ICANN should avoid the use of auctions of last resort, that is, the ICANN auctions, where there are contentions between commercial and non-commercial applications, and that ICANN should instead look at alternative means to resolve those types of contention. Meanwhile, the recommendations that the SubPro working group had given were that auctions of last resort should continue to be used to resolve contention. And so we therefore have a direct conflict between that policy recommendation from the community and the GAC advice. So during its board meeting at ICANN80, the board formally made a decision that it would not, or intended not to, follow the GAC advice, and it gave notice to the GAC to that effect. And whilst I think it's really disappointing that it's taken the ICANN board a year to reach this position, it does now initiate a formal consultation process that's required under the bylaws between the GAC and the board before the board can move forward in the manner that it intends. Meanwhile, there is still GAC advice outstanding, which is to ban or strongly disincentivize private monetary means of resolution of contention sets, including private auctions. And whilst the board is certainly much more in favour of following that part of the GAC advice, it is still considering how to make that work in practice. It is also worth noting that coming out of ICANN80, we did receive yet more advice on this topic from the GAC, including giving advice to the board that it should initiate a community discussion to find an alternative to all forms of auction. So although, as I say, we've now had some progress in the sense that the board has kicked off the formal consultation that allows it to reject the GAC advice about ICANN auctions of last resort between commercial and non-commercial applications, this whole topic of how contention is resolved and whether there are auctions used at all, and whether indeed private forms of resolution will be allowed to occur, is still very much up in the air, unfortunately. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Sophie, who will be talking about DNS abuse.
Thanks, Susan. So this was the first ICANN meeting since the DNS abuse amendments came into effect, and it was clear that the industry was on the same page about moving onwards and upwards. So just as a reminder, on 5th of April this year, gTLD registries and ICANN accredited registrars had new obligations enter into force requiring them to action reports of DNS abuse to either mitigate or stop the DNS abuse. These amendments were the product of negotiations initiated by registries and registrars to have ICANN hold them to higher standards under their contracts. So far, we've seen that ICANN compliance has been working to enforce these new obligations over the last couple of months. Ahead of ICANN80, they published a blog reporting that since the amendments came into force, 2,528 domain names were suspended and 328 phishing websites disabled from their enforcement activities. This is in addition to the reports and actions registries and registrars have been taking themselves without any enforcement action. The gTLD community is keen to push forward with their momentum on addressing abuse, conducting outreach sessions again at this ICANN meeting, talking about human rights impact assessments and how that can be used to inform approaches to DNS abuse mitigation. But also meeting with the CCNSO to share the impacts and learnings from the amendments. So the CCNSO is the group similar to the GNSO except for gTLDs. So during that session between the gTLDs and gTLDs, it was emphasised that when one space becomes too difficult for bad actors, they tend to look to move to another space where it's easier. So as the gTLDs work hard on making their space less attractive, it's important for other spaces and other TLDs to prepare that potentially bad actors might look to move towards their spaces if they're perceived to be an easy option. So it was a lot of words of encouragement to CCTLDs who don't have that single regulator like gTLDs, encouraging them to update their own abuse practices and to borrow from the negotiated language that they have in their contracts now, and any other practices that they've been publishing and talking about. The onwards and upwards attitude was also shared by the ICANN board, who just before ICANN80 rejected a recommendation from SubPro that proposed that single registrant gTLD registries be allowed to request a waiver for certain abuse obligations that not be permitted. So under specification 11 sections 3A and B, registries are still required to require their registrars to have terms in their registrant agreements that domains registered cannot be used for malware, botnets, phishing, piracy, trademark or copyright infringement, counterfeiting, fraudulent or deceptive practices, and also to conduct security threats regularly on their namespace and maintain reports. So the board reasoned that while the risk was low for single registrant gTLDs and the harms limited if the checks weren't going through and abuse was being unmitigated in the spaces, if the waivers were available, then there still was that risk that abuse could be unchecked and unmitigated. So all in all, it was a very clear message from across the community that we don't want to leave cracks open and opportunities for DNS abuse.
Thank you very much, Sophie, Susan and Ashley for the update, and thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any additional questions or would like us to discuss more topics, please send an email to podcast@comlaude.com. If you'd like to hear our post-ICANN updates in the future, or learn more about the next round of TLD applications, subscribe to our podcast on Spotify and Apple, or follow our YouTube channel and LinkedIn account. Have a good day!